Stefan, I cannot think of a better way to bring down the curtain.
Did you see that? He ran up the wall like a ninja and landed a high kick. Unbelievable. I've never seen anything like that. It's like something out of a movie.
On December 16th, 2010, the World Extreme Cage Fighting Promotion, or WEC, held its final fight card. Afterwards, its talent in lower weight classes were to be absorbed by the UFC. It went out with a kick that was heard around the world. Anthony Pettis and his Showtime kick on Benson Henderson remains one of the most iconic moments of not only the entire WEC promotion, but also in the sport's history. Part of the story that many fans were ignorant about is that the kick didn't actually knock Benson out. In fact, up until that point, the fight between the two had been very back and forth, and that the Showtime kick pretty much sealed the fight for Pettis, leading to a unanimous decision win. Another part of the card that not many people remember is that the co-main event was a young Dominic Cruz putting an absolute masterclass on Scott Jorgensen to retain his WEC bantamweight title, which would then immediately be transferred over into a UFC title. One of the most unique features of the WEC was its blue cage. The color blue by and large has represented themes of calmness, trust, loyalty, and stability. Over 50% of all nations' flags have the color blue. Many pop culture icons that either are or contain the color blue have also represented these themes. And in the late 1990s, a video game console would be released that would become famous for its use of the color, especially its bright blue skyboxes. The Sega Dreamcast is my favorite video game console of all time. It's weird to say that given how few games I actually owned on it compared to other consoles, that this off-color beige brick represented some of the best gaming memories I've ever had. Like all great memories, however, it's likely the pure nostalgia of when I played it. And in many ways, there was no greater time period than when the Sega Dreamcast was released. There's a reason the 90s are so fondly looked upon. It was a time of revolution like no other. The internet as a consumer product started to explode in popularity, and its accessibility was increasing every day. The economy was booming nearly worldwide. Pop culture, technology, and social expression were all the rage, and it was all seen through wide-eyed optimism and innovation.
You got a shtick, it'll take you to the top.
And at the peak of this prosperity, the gaming company Sega released what was to be their flagship console into the new millennium. A little over 12 years after the Dreamcast's public release, the economy of mixed martial arts was in a similar boom. 2011 was a great time to be an MMA fan. UFC stars like George St. Pierre and Anderson Silva were at the peak of their popularity. New stars like John Jones and Cain Velasquez were quickly gaining traction. Other promotions like Strikeforce and Bellator were developing hardcore MMA fan favorites like Nick Diaz, Alistair Overeem, Gilbert Melendez, Luke Rockhold, Eddie Alvarez, and Michael Chandler. The UFC was on the brink of entering the most important TV deal of their existence at the time with Fox. It didn't hurt that the year began with one of the best MMA fights of the entire year in Frankie Edgar vs. Gray Maynard 2. And as mentioned before, the WEC was merging into the UFC. Lightweight talents like Anthony Pettis, Benson Henderson, and Donald Cerrone were going to showcase their talents on the biggest MMA stage in the world. And perhaps best of all, two brand new weight classes were being added in featherweight and bantamweight, their champions being Jose Aldo and, as mentioned at the beginning of this video, Dominic Cruz. And one pay-per-view in July of 2011 culminated every single one of these fresh and exciting vibes, in the same fashion the Sega Dreamcast did in 1998. WEC 53 may have been the final WEC card, where Dominic Cruz retained his bantamweight title and was promoted to a UFC champion, but the WEC event before that, WEC 52, was headlined by the only man to have given Cruz a loss at that point in his career, in one California kid, Uriah Faber. Years previously, Uriah Faber had been the longest-standing WEC featherweight champion, where one of his defenses for the belt was against a fellow California native in Cruz, where he quickly dispatched him with a guillotine submission. Cruz would return to the WEC promotion a little over a year later, in June of 2008, where he would drop down to bantamweight and become the champion of that weight class within 2 years, in March of 2010. Meanwhile, by this time, Uriah Faber's career was at a bit of a crossroads. When Cruz made his bantamweight debut in 2008 at WEC 34, Uriah Faber actually headlined the card. where he successfully defended his featherweight title for the final time against former UFC lightweight champion Jens Pulver. Now in March of 2010, Faber was 2-2 and had lost his featherweight title to Mike Brown, also losing to him again in a rematch. Faber had one more shot to regain his long-worn featherweight crown a month later in April of 2010 against 23-year-old Jose Aldo, who had taken the title from Brown in 2009. It didn't go well. Faber was outclassed and battered by the younger, faster, and more technically sound fighter in Jose Aldo. This was when the 30-year-old Faber decided it was time for a change, and he would drop down to Cruz's division of bantamweight and chase his belt. The roles had been reversed.
Probably eventually, before it's all said and done, I will have fought him again with or without the belt, whether he has it or not, but I think it's a fight that's going to happen.
Faber would submit his opponent at WEC 52 in Takeo Mizugaki, and after the WEC merged with the UFC, Uriah Faber would secure his second win in the division against a former WEC bantamweight champion in Eddie Wineland in March of 2011 at UFC 128.
Dominic, if you're out there, hide your kids, hide your wife, hide that UFC belt, baby. Come and get it.
With a final call-out, the rematch between Cruz and Faber was eventually booked for UFC 132 on July 2nd, 2011. The most West Coast rivalry between two lower weight class fighters had truly taken spark. However, Faber and Cruz weren't the only two former WEC champions that entered the UFC cage that July evening. When the Sega Dreamcast released, while it was a very exciting and revolutionary time for gaming, it entered the fray with stiff established competition in the Sony PlayStation and the Nintendo 64, which were both already well established in the market. The PlayStation had already beaten out Sega's previous console, the Saturn, and in the year of the release of the Dreamcast in Japan, which was 1998, the Nintendo 64 was releasing some of the best titles of all time. Banjo-Kazooie, Ocarina of Time, Turok 2, and Rogue Squadron were just some examples. When the WEC fighters merged with the UFC, they immediately got to learn how stiff the competition was. Anthony Pettis, who had landed the Showtime kick as we mentioned at the beginning, actually lost his first fight with the promotion against lightweight gatekeeper Clay Guida. Curiously enough, the man he beat to win the WEC title in Benson Henderson and another WEC lightweight standout in Donald Cowboy Cerrone had far more success in their transitions into the UFC, with Benson even earning a title shot by the end of the year. One former WEC champion that entered the UFC 2 years prior and was on the hunt for his own title shot was one Carlos Condit, the natural-born killer. Condit was the WEC welterweight champion with 3 defenses when the division was dissolved by the UFC. While Condit had stumbled into the promotion losing a closely contested fight against Martin Kampmann, the killer immediately went on a tear afterwards, winning 3 straight against welterweight mainstay Jake Ellenberger, red-hot prospect Rory McDonald, and former title contender Dan Hardy. At the time, the Ellenberger fight was the only decision Condit had ever won, which had earned him the violent nickname he had. And at UFC 132, the killer was pitted against one who was supposed to be his toughest stylistic matchup. The stun gun, Dong-Hyun Kim, was a technically undefeated fighter who utilized his size and sambo background to drag opponents down and wear them out. At the time, the only blemish in his career had come against welterweight veteran Cairo Parisian via split decision, but the loss had been overturned after Cairo had tested positive for painkillers. Carlos Condit may have been one of the most exciting strikers in the sport, but his weakness had always been his grappling defense. 3 of his previous 5 losses had come via way of submission, and in his 2 decision losses, he was out-grappled by the aforementioned Martin Kampmann and Jake Shields. The UFC 132 prelims had been a mixed bag. While every fight on the early Facebook prelims had been a lackluster decision affair, the Spike TV portion was explosive, with lightweight standouts Melvin Gillard and Rafael dos Anjos both getting quick knockout finishes. Carlos Condit and Dong-Hyun Kim entered the green Bud Light Lime Don cage to open the pay-per-view main card. Would Condit continue the trend of violence, or would Kim exploit Condit's grappling deficiencies to a lackluster decision loss? We got our answer less than 3 minutes into the first round.
Condit with a
Condit's vicious KO of Kim kicked off the explosive night of fights on the main card, and shot Condit into stardom. His knockout of Kim would eventually earn Condit a shot at the title, a story that's worth its own retrospective, while the 27-year-old could not feel more euphoric about his fighting career. The 2 men that entered the cage after him were experiencing the exact opposite. By the time the Dreamcast entered the market, its contemporaries in the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 were already considered outdated products. The graphics of the PlayStation 1 were considered jagged and warped, whereas the Nintendo 64's visuals were slow and blocky. When the Dreamcast showed off its technical capabilities with games like Sonic Adventure and flawless ports of arcade titles like Crazy Taxi and Soul Calibur, it blew anything the previous generation of consoles were capable of producing. Their technology was simply outdated. 36-year-old Tito Ortiz entered the octagon at UFC 132, winless in his last 5 fights. The man called the Huntington Beach Bad Boy was once considered one of the greatest light heavyweights in the sport, having won the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship and defending it a record 5 times. But now, nearly 8 years after losing the belt, Ortiz was on the brink of losing his job within the promotion. It's no secret that Tito did not get along with UFC president Dana White or the UFC brass. Tito had known Dana White on a personal level for many years, White even being Tito's manager before becoming the president of the promotion. And over time, their relationship had become a very troubled and toxic one. While he was mocked at the time, Tito Ortiz made solid points about fighter pay and how the organization was taking advantage of its athletes. A sentiment that has only gotten stronger and has become more widely accepted as the years have gone on. Dana thought Tito was self-centered, ignorant, and lacked self-awareness. And to be fair to White, there was some merit to this claim as well.
I want to tell me what you see. Let's go ahead and see by the fight what you saw in the ring.
And these sentiments have also only gotten stronger over time. Prior to UFC 132, White was insistent that this would be Tito's last fight in the UFC if he had lost. And the promotion did him no favors booking him against a young and powerful prospect in Ryan Bader, a man who had won Season 8 of The Ultimate Fighter and used his size and power to absolutely bully his opposition. The only blemish of his career had come earlier that year, but the man he lost to was John Jones, so it's hard to take too much away from him with that one. Bader was a massive 450 betting favorite against Ortiz, and when the two entered the octagon, the crowd and watchers at home were prepared to watch an aging legend be put out to pasture. The Dreamcast may have been released with all the technological power and optimism possible, but its contemporaries knew the score and had been on the market for multiple years. If someone were to ask you whether games like Ocarina of Time and Metal Gear Solid, or games like Sonic Adventure and Shenmue have aged better, I think there'd be a pretty clear answer.
Do you know of a place where sailors hang out?
Sailors?
Age hasn't slowed you down one bit.
Big punch by Tito Ortiz. Tito trying to choke him out. It's all over. Tito Ortiz has beaten Ryan Bader. Unbelievable. What a huge victory for Tito Ortiz.
Ortiz's shocking submission win over Ryan Bader blew the doors off the MGM Grand Garden Arena. The written-off legend of the sport had just beaten Ryan Bader faster than John Jones had. His typically black and orange fight shorts shone in white and blue, reflecting the massive undertaking he had just accomplished. Even his biggest critic in Dana White had to stand and applaud Tito. Ortiz had not only saved his job, but made everyone a believer of him again, if only for one night, and walked away with a submission of the night bonus and a revitalized career. Unfortunately, the same could not be said about the next legend of the card. After a lackluster mid-card fight between Dennis Seaver and Matt Wyman, which concluded in a decision win for Seaver, the explosive co-main event between Ultimate Fighter Season 1 alumni Chris Lieben and former Legend of Pride Vanderlei Silva was set to heat the card back up after Seaver's win had cooled the vibe. While Lieben was coming off of a loss to Brian Stann in his previous fight, Lieben was riding a 3-fight winning streak beforehand and contributed his loss to Stan on having flu-like symptoms before the fight took place. Meanwhile, Vanderlei Silva was 2-5 in his last 7, and was a far cry from the dominant marauder he was the previous decade in Pride. However, Vanderlei was coming off of a win to the much younger Michael Bisping, and while not a dominant KO win, it was a clear decision victory for the Axe Murderer. The odds were close for this fight, with Lieben even being a slight underdog. Maybe it was more than just a cold for the much younger Lieben as to why he lost to Stan. Maybe, just maybe, pride wouldn't die tonight. Lieben knocked Vanderlei out in less than 30 seconds. can't stop advancement. Time moves forward whether you want it to or not. Once you reach a certain age, your body just can't catch up. Sony and Nintendo were already working on their successors to the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 by the time the Dreamcast was released in 1998. Even their creators knew they were on borrowed time and had to move forward. As mentioned previously, times had never moved faster in the sphere of MMA than in 2011. It was firing on all cylinders, and every week felt like a new and exciting development was taking place. Watching grainy 240p resolution Pride replays on Dailymotion and Break.com, or watching highlights set to DMX or the Pride theme on YouTube were long gone. Lieben's quick work of Vanderlei that night brought that fact to the forefront like a freight train. Earlier that year, fellow Pride legend Mirko Cro Cop had been viciously KO'd by heavyweight prospect Brendan Schaub. Fedor Emelianenko was on a 2-fight losing streak. Big Nog had been KO'd by Cain Velasquez in his last fight at the time. Takanori Gomi had just been submitted by Clay Guida earlier that year. The young had truly begun to eat the old, and the old were left to wander in a world that either had largely forgotten them or didn't even know who they were. And unfortunately for Vanderlei Silva, the card by design had to do the same, as it was time for the main event, and time for the future to have their time in the spotlight. Make no mistake, Uriah Faber was the more popular fighter between himself and Cruz. He was naturally more charismatic and exciting. He finished way more of his fights. He had created an entire gym culture of lower weight class fighters in Team Alpha Male. He had talents like Joseph Benavidez, TJ Dillashaw, and Chad Mendes under his wing. It can be argued that his contributions to the sport with his time in the WEC is the reason why the UFC took a risk on the much lower weight classes, whereas before they were reluctant to even have the most diverse weight class in lightweight on the roster. But Faber was an old-school, blood-and-sweat wrestle boxer who relied on fast overhands, powerful takedowns, and club and sub groundwork. His game was nothing new. His speed and athleticism just carried him to the next level. Meanwhile, Dominick Cruz had developed a unique and awkward style that relied on footwork, feints, peppering shots, and unorthodox takedowns and control. It was very ahead of its time, and was extremely frustrating for his opponents and for many old-school fans of the sport. And while Faber was the naturally more charismatic of the two, Cruz was definitely more visceral and cerebral. His trash talk was poignant and directed at his opponent's most insecure parts of themselves.
Alright, man, I'm done talking to you.
You can't be done talking to me. You're right here facing me, dummy. You gotta talk to me. You have no choice. You got nowhere to go. Keep talking.
If Faber was the Nintendo 64 or PlayStation, and UFC 132 as a whole was the Dreamcast, Dominick Cruz was the Sony PlayStation 2 coming to dominate the better part of the 2000s gaming decade. This was not the same bowl-cut 21-year-old kid Faber had submitted 4 years previously. This was the evolution of the sport of MMA, coming at him and fully closing that generational gap. And the fight played out exactly like that. After a somewhat strong start for Faber, Cruz completely and thoroughly outworked, outmaneuvered, and outsmarted Faber to a lopsided decision victory. Faber maintained a narrative that he believed he had won the fight, but it was likely more as fuel for self-motivation to get back to Cruz as quickly as he could. UFC 132 was one of the best cards of 2011, with every kind of fan being able to walk away satisfied, while also feeling a bit of catharsis and reflection. The bright green aesthetic of the cage and the ring girls from the aforementioned Bud Light Lime sponsorship burned into every MMA fan's memory. This card was equal parts excitement for what was to come, celebration for what had been accomplished in the present, and adoration for which had come previously. The Dreamcast's relaxing blue sky aesthetic reflected the same tone of optimism and euphoria that MMA was riding in the hot summer of 2011. But unfortunately, like the days of the Dreamcast, these days were very numbered. While the new millennium promised untold societal growth, technological advancement, and times of prosperity, very few of those things lasted. By October of 2002, 78% of the stock market value gained from the dot-com revolution had completely disappeared. America was at war with the Middle East, and cases of depression had doubled amongst the populace from 3.33% to 7.06%. The Sega Dreamcast completely bombed in the market, quickly being swallowed up by industry titans like Sony and Nintendo, and being completely outclassed by newcomer to console gaming in Microsoft and their Xbox. Sega would never develop a mainline console ever again. Dominick Cruz would fight one more time in 2011, but would then be sidelined for the majority of the better part of the next 5 years with a slew of injuries, fighting only once between all of 2012 and 2015. Uriah Faber would never touch UFC gold. Chris Lieben's 27-second knockout of Vanderlei Silva was the final win of his career, and he would lose all of his subsequent fights, battle addiction, and face domestic problems for the better part of the decade. Tito Ortiz would never win inside the UFC octagon again after his shocking submission over Ryan Bader, losing 3 more fights before leaving the promotion for good. Carlos Condit won interim welterweight gold in his next fight against Nick Diaz, but the way he decided to fight in that bout was widely criticized, and for a time completely undid all the good faith he had built with the fan base and his previously exciting and violent fighting style. The Fox deal for the first year was a complete disaster for the UFC. The debut televised heavyweight title fight between challenger Junior Dos Santos and a heavily compromised champion in Cain Velasquez ended in little over a minute after an hour-long program of build-up. One of the UFC's biggest stars in Georges St. Pierre would tear his ACL in late 2011, leading to a 1.5-year hiatus between fights. Another one of the UFC's biggest stars in Brock Lesnar would officially retire from the sport at the end of 2011 due to health concerns after having his guts completely rearranged by the debuting Alistair Overeem. The sunny summer of 2011 had been replaced with a dark cloud of uncertainty by the end of the year. However, like all things in life, the bad times eventually level out, and after a period of immense relief and joy, the mundane status quo of life takes center stage again. The Sega Dreamcast is now widely regarded as one of the most underrated gaming consoles of all time, with hidden gems like Power Stone, Skies of Arcadia, Jet Set Radio, and Rez now being seen as cult classics in gaming, and also as a relic for simpler and happier times. Dominick Cruz climbed back to eventually reclaim and defend his bantamweight title again against Uriah Faber, and eventually became one of the key commentary workers for the UFC. Uriah Faber would have an immensely successful career in the UFC, with all but 3 of his losses being exclusively for the title. He now has a beautiful family, and seems incredibly healthy for a former fighter nearing his 5th decade of life. Chris Lieben would eventually turn his life around and have a successful stunt in bare-knuckle boxing before becoming a ref and judge for the sport of MMA, even judging a bantamweight title fight for the UFC in 2025. Vanderlei Silva would go on to have 2 incredible wins in the UFC after his loss to Lieben, closing out his tenure with the promotion, KOing Brian Stann in the same arena that made him who he was in Pride FC, the Saitama Super Arena in Japan. Tito Ortiz, for better or for worse, would continue to compete till 2019 and has managed to stay relevant all these years, even into the mid-2020s. Again, for better or for worse. Ryan Bader went on to become one of the most dominant Bellator champions of all time, becoming one of the only 2 double champions that promotion ever had. Carlos Condit would go on to win the fans back with exciting and violent fights after the Nick Diaz hiccup, nearly knocking out GSP and having bloody wars like his rematch against Martin Kampmann and his fight against Thiago Alves, as well as putting on one of the absolute greatest title fights in MMA history against Robbie Lawler. And Dong Hyun Kim even went on to become a YouTube celebrity in Korea with Stun Gun TV, amassing over 1 million subscribers, and as of 2025, his videos still hit well over the 100,000 view mark. The UFC would go on to rebound from a shaky later part of 2011 and 2012, having just recently signed a $7.7 billion deal with Paramount as of 2025. The promises made by UFC 132 may not have been fulfilled the way we would have hoped, but the aftermath highlights a level of tenacity and resolution that the human spirit continues to be capable of. And as we head into an uncertain future, or anytime anyone who watches this video is facing a challenging time in their life, just remember there will always be blue skies on the horizon.